Magdalena was a 21-year-old girl who had a boyfriend that she was dating. I mean, in almost every way, she was a typical 21-year-old young woman. She worked hard. She was not much of a partier at all. She's found sitting, kind of seated in the back driver's side, nude except for her pants and panties are around one ankle. Shot, I think, 11 times, if I recall correctly. But we had no idea whose DNA it belonged to because whoever's it was not in the DNA database.
In the second trial, he claimed you threatened him in the interview.
Like, there's only something like 8 billion people in the world. It's you, brother. There ain't nobody else.
With the craziness of this case, do you feel like justice was served? So today we're talking about the unfortunate events around Magdalena Idzikowska. First, before we go on to it, tell me a little bit about who Magdalene was.
So Magdalena was a 21-year-old girl who was, graduated from Lane Tech High School, which is a pretty well-known, famous high school here on Chicago's North Side. She had been taking some college classes, but she got a job at the same company her mother worked at, which is kind of a healthcare clearinghouse for unions, like, workers' unions. And it's a pretty good job. She worked there. She had a boyfriend that she was dating. I mean, in almost every way, she was a typical 21-year-old young woman. She worked hard. She was not much of a partier at all. I mean, reportedly for her 21st birthday, she went out and had 2 drinks. She, at the time that, we dealt with her, she had no blood or, no drugs or alcohol in her system. It was pretty much, parents were Polish immigrants, but she's kind of first generation American. So kind of like exploring that world I think is common with, first generation kids. And that was her in a nutshell.
Good. I'd read that she had like almost 2 jobs in the same company. She was an interpreter and a clerk. Is that right?
Correct. That's correct. She spoke Polish fluently, and yeah, she was a clerk. She had a lot of friends, which would play a part in the case later. Yeah, she was just kind of, popular, and well liked.
Before we do go on to some of these friends and some of the people that maybe weren't friendly with her, but unfortunately became a big part of her life. Tell me a little bit about this boyfriend of hers.
Yeah, so her boyfriend, Joanne Spruill, in a case like that, domestic, that wasn't at all domestic, but in a case of when female victims get killed, especially shot and killed, um, the natural you kind of have to write out the husband, boyfriend, close associate, because the odds turn out a lot of times to be, that it does turn out to be some domestic thing. So Juwan, the spotlight was on him pretty hard early, but he was very cooperative, immediately submitted his DNA sample when it was requested. He had a strong alibi. He was at work that night, checked and double checked that alibi. And, he was cooperative throughout. He was devastated by her loss. And at times, as you can imagine, he would get frustrated that, he was, being questioned so much. But he never varied from that. He was a hardworking young man, worked for a railroad, and, had very little criminal background. And I think that what he did have was minor stuff, like traffic. Um, so, uh, nothing negative really to say about Joanne Spruill.
So we'll start to paint the picture of what was found originally before we go on to the details that were found later on. So tell me a little bit about what Israel Gonzalez found on the morning he went to work at a gas station.
So Israel Gonzalez worked at a gas station. That her car, she was found shot to death in the back of her car. And she had a 4-door smaller Nissan, I believe, and she's found sitting, kind of seated in the back driver's side, back seat, nude except for her pants and panties are around one ankle, shot horribly, shot I think 11 times if I recall correctly. Um, and where she was parked was along this kind of industrial area, had some old like grain silos, which have since been torn down. And the end of the street was a kind of a T ended, and at the other side of that T was a gas station. So Israel Gonzalez ran that gas station. He shows up that morning and he um, sees the car parked down there, but it's still kind of dusk. This is November, so like 5:30 a.m. It's still a little dark, pretty dark, and but he doesn't pay a lot of attention to it. And then a little bit later, a customer comes that he has known before. It's getting lighter. He looks down, he sees the car, and he says, "I think I recognize that car." And in fact, she had had her car worked on at that gas station because it was kind of between her home and her job. So she'd stop there and get gas. They serviced her car a couple times, and they noticed the door was open, and they were both like, "Yes, so this doesn't look right." You know what I mean? So then another gentleman who works in a factory kind of noticed the same thing, and they converge on the car about the same time. And I think they communicated somehow, either verbally or through hand signals, like, what it, and when they got up to the car, they saw not only was the car door open, her legs were outside. And I think they took one look in and were like, oh, oh no, this is bad. And they called 911.
When you go back and you find out about the sin and you find out what Israel saw, did anything about where the blood on her body was? Because from right I'm saying it was only from the chest up.
Yeah, yeah, pretty much. Abdomen, chest. She had a defensive wound. It's one of those things that, you see a lot of horrible things as a homicide detective over the years. And sometimes you see things and in your head, you kind of know what they mean and they don't leave you. And she had a kind of part of her finger hand that was blown off. And that clearly was like a defensive wound, putting her hand up, probably begging for mercy. And that really struck me. And then as the case developed, and this was a kind of a bit of time because we had crime scene photos to go over this since we didn't have the scene. And I stared at those photos for countless hours over the years, thinking, what am I missing here? And there were several things that always troubled me and my partners about it. One of which was the nature of the wounds, and that the wounds in her lower abdomen like this were angular wounds. And then the wounds in her upper body and her head were more direct wounds. And she had, kind of what we call a coup de grace type wound right to the side of her head, meaning, the killer had put the gun to her head to really make sure she was gone. And so it occurred to us that something happened and he must have like shot his way in. The first couple shots were at an angle, a little willy-nilly, and then they became more focused. So our kind of hypothesis was that he had kind of shot his way in. And that was later bolstered by putting together a little bit more of the crime scene that baffled us from the start, which I can get into if you like, unless you have other questions about that.
See, there is something originally that baffled me when I read about it was that there was no coat, no purse, no ID of Madeline found, and her clothes weren't real. They weren't really destroyed. Didn't really look like they were ripped.
Yeah, right. And like I said, she was nude. She was nude except for her jeans and panties were around one ankle and she had one boot off. So what we believe happened there was it was a straight sexual assault. He forced her to take her clothes off at gunpoint. And and then proceeded to have sex with her. She had signs of sex according to the medical examiner and the sperm inside of her. So um, she also had, not coincidentally, I guess, a bruise on her right shin, kind of thigh, which after some fashion, we kind of figured out that that was likely the bottom of the door. And the other part of it that baffled us for a long time, we finally went out, the car was still impounded, and we looked at the car again and we kind of figured it out. So if you look at the original crime scene photos, she's, they documented it really well. She's in the back seat of her car, and the window of that back door that she's sitting outside of, that's open, she's sitting inside of, her legs are outside of. That window is broken out, but it is lying about 1 foot in front of, towards the front of the car, um, the door, intact on the ground. And it struck us as so odd in the crime scene photos. Like, how does that happen? Like, I mean, the window is broken and flies out, but how's it stay intact? I mean, we struggled with that for a while, and then we finally went out to the pound and looked at the car again. And by this time, they had taken that window and just placed it in the rear seat where she had been. And we got to look at it, and then we realized it had two things with it. One, it had a tinting film. You know how people tint the windows on their car to make them darker, so either people can't see inside or protect against the sun, whatever. And this particular window tint was a film that went over it, and it had a bullet hole in the middle of it. There was an entrance one going into the car. So what we figured happened was that, likely after he forces her to have sex, um, I don't know if there's a threat there or what, but he has the gun, and she tries to either close the door or he slams the door, which hits her in the leg, causing the bruise, and he shoots through the window towards her, which shatters that window, but it stays intact because it's got that window tint film on it. And then he flings the door open, and that causes it to dislodge and fly out onto the ground, still staying intact because of the film. It's a very odd thing. But once all that, we kind of got that, then it made sense, all that shooting, the way the shooting went down, because if he shot through the window to get to her and open the door, and she's kind of recoiling in horror and shoots his way in, that's going to explain those kind of angular shots, and then gets on top of her, and then the direct, shots down and to the side of her head, which is all very graphic and horrible to hear. But we kind of had to kind of come to that realization just by putting together, the scene photos and the evidence in the scene, because there were shell casings on the exterior of the car, spent shell casings, meaning, fired bullets, the casing, and then spent shell casings inside of the car. So the shooting happened both in and outside of the car. So then it kind of all came together. You know what I mean?
I'm sure anybody listening now, with all the advancements in technology and all these true crime movies that we see all the time, have heard by now that there is something that is left on the scene that could make up a DNA profile of someone. So you could get to what could be the suspect quicker. But can you tell me a little bit about the issue that you ran into with this?
Sure. So that is accurate. I mean, there's not always like DNA cases, unfortunately, or whatever, or DNA is strong evidence, but you really have to think about it like a fingerprint, right? So, as an example, we did not, but had we found Joanne Spruill's DNA in the way of sperm inside of her, that would not necessarily have made him the killer, right? Because it's her boyfriend, they're involved in a relationship. It wouldn't have necessarily excluded or included him, but it was not his DNA. It did not match anyone in the DNA database. And this is 2001. So DNA was pretty common at that time. The technology was there, but it's made tremendous jumps in advancement since then. But so the problem we had was we had the DNA of who we believed the killer was, because it didn't look like consensual sex the way it was, the scene was laid out. But we had no idea whose DNA it belonged to because whoever's it was not in the DNA database. And this is where in her, kind of her popularity came in play, which hindered us to a degree because we literally had to track down every male friend that she'd had, whether she dated them or not. And again, she was a popular girl. So over the course of several years, we had to locate every guy that she knew, had dated, had been friends with, whether they'd had a sexual relationship or not, and ask them to consent to the buccal swab, which is the DNA standard, and have those compared. So we did. I don't remember how many, but possibly as many as 15 or more of those, and they were all negative. So that really kind of deepened the mystery with this case.
So, as anyone can hear now, you went into this case now with no real clear idea of who a suspect could be or what fully happened. You can form an idea in your head, but you have no specifics. So you obviously then start to work back from the scene of what happened before, and what did you find out that happened in the days leading?
Well, so one of the critical things was her phone records, and we always kind of knew that was going to be important because she had made a call. She left her house about midnight on that Saturday night, Sunday morning, and drove to the place where she was killed and arrived on that scene. There was video. Unfortunately, it was really poor old school video that we could never clean up to show us much or have, cleaned up. We actually, one of my partners took that to NASA, the space people, because somebody told us they're the best at cleaning up these old like VHS. But we were hindered by the fact that it rained most of that night, and the camera was one of the old school big cameras you used to see on the side of buildings, and it had a housing over it. And every time a raindrop would hit it, the ambient street lights would kind of star out and it would just completely blur whatever it was filming. It was incredibly frustrating. But what was important about that video though, we saw what turned out to be her car pull in like at 12:05, 12:06, which is basically the exact time it would take to drive from her house to that place. And so about 11:20 that night, she had either I think she placed a call to a cell phone, talked to that person on that cell phone for 20 minutes, and then about 15 minutes later at midnight, she leaves her apartment and ends up on this scene. So it's the last person that we know of that she talked to, right? Unfortunately, that phone was what we call on the street a burnout phone, meaning it was opened under false pretenses, often used by like drug gangs and stuff so they can't be tracked. In this particular case, there was a 75-year-old woman on the west side of Chicago who'd had her purse stolen like a month before, and they used her ID to open this kind of fake phone. And so we knew we kind of had to identify who that person was that had that phone. But back to the video really quickly, it was not helpful except that you could see her lights pull in and park at like 12:07. And if you watch the whole video, like 9 hours, which I did multiple times, when it gets daylight, you can see that it's still her car. It hasn't moved. The door is open. You can see Israel Gonzalez, the other two subjects kind of walk up, look, walk away. So you know it's her car. You can actually see about 5 minutes after she pulls in another car pull in, is there for a few minutes, and then backs out and leave, which is very likely the killer's car. But that was the incredibly frustrating thing about this case. we were never able to make any hay with that film to be able to identify that car at all. Um, so, and NASA uh, was super helpful, but the first time we went down there to let them try and work on it, they had one of the second space shuttle crash, unfortunately. So they shut down everything and couldn't do anything. And we kind of forgot about him. And then, like 6 or 8 months later, they called us and say, "Hey, are you guys still interested in us reviewing that video?" And we're like, "Yeah, we absolutely are." So my partner flew to Florida with the tape because they don't want to be part of the chain of custody, and had them go over it. And unfortunately, they couldn't do much with it. Interesting side note to the case. But another reason that, the kind of adjudication of this case took so long, there was a lot of groundwork on this case.
Yeah. Part of that groundwork was trying to figure out who Magdalene was friends with or who she hung out with. So, can you give us an introduction to who Tamara Conlon is?
Yeah, Tamara Cologne was a coworker of hers and like her best friend at work and kind of a confidant. They stayed pretty close. In the long term in the case, Tamara Cologne became important because she was friends with the guy who turned out to be the killer. Tamara knew nothing about the murder, knew nothing really about kind of had developed as a relationship between the killer and Magdalena, although she did introduce them. The killer one time came to their work to bring Tamara a sandwich, and Magdalena happened to be out with her, and they were introduced. Tamara, I think she did tell us that they had exchanged phone numbers. I could be wrong about that. But what she definitely told us was they had met and kind of made a connection, but she had no further knowledge as to whether they'd ever communicated after that meeting. It turned out they had, but Tamara had no knowledge of it. But Tamara gave us great background on that. I mean, that really helped us solve the case. Her willingness to be helpful with what she did. And she did give us some kind of background on Magdalena, which helped. Said she was very friendly. She could be a little bit gullible, and she wasn't really cheating on her boyfriend, but she would, if guys acted like they had money, she would sometimes flirt with them, which became, I think, part of the case.
Did that information of Magdalena would flirt for to get people to lend her money and stuff? Did that towards the back end of the case start to maybe raise some eyebrows of what you should be looking for?
Yeah, it did. It did because, once we kind of identified who the killer was, and we actually did that through the phone records, which was a long, arduous process. That's a much faster process in today's world with computer technology, but back then it was straight. You got the phone records of the phone, the stolen phone. You got Magdalena's phone records, and then you'd have to order what we call muds and tolls, which is the phone records of the phones they called, and just track people down and talk to them and say, "Hey, do you remember anybody had that phone?" You have to be really careful with that as best you can because you don't know who the killer is going to turn out to be. So you don't want to front them off and give them an idea you might be on to them. So we had to really play some silly games of like, we're looking into this theft, identity theft of the woman's purse or all kinds of ruses to try and get people to talk to us about who they might know who knew that phone. And that was fruitless for years, a lot of work. And then we finally got a break with a woman who happened to be dating our killer, whose name turned out to be William Moore during that time period, and we had looked for her for like 2 years, but it turned out she had moved to southern part of the United States, Arkansas or Tennessee, Memphis, I mean, Mississippi, I don't recall. I think it was Arkansas, but he we went and interviewed her sister, and she goes, "No, you're looking for my sister, Wanda," and she moved to Arkansas. We're like, "Oh, okay, do you know where she's at in Arkansas?" "Well, she's actually in Chicago visiting." This is literally how quick this happened over years. in one day, she's like, "Yeah, she's visiting now, and I can take you to her." So we did, and we're like, "Hey, Wanda, did you?" There was also a bunch of calls from that call to a particular grocery store chain, which confused us because it had called like 5 or 6 of these stores, and it did occur to us maybe work there, but we didn't have enough information to go to the stores and say, "Hey, do you know somebody that has a phone like this?" We did check with emergency contacts, but we didn't want to do it that kind of broad shotgun approach and potentially scare off what might be our offender. So we were really trying to be delicate with that. But we got the break when we found one to hell. And she goes, "Yeah, I was dating this guy who worked with me at Cubs Foods, which is now a defunct grocery store chain. So I don't mind mentioning it. But and we were like, Shazam, Cubs Foods, a lot of calls to Cubs Foods. Who's this guy? And then that started the kind of dominoes to fall, which I can give you more detail on that. But so that was the break, and that was 3 years into it.
Yep. The reading it is it's a long, long, overdrawn case, and we've mentioned his name now, so we might as well introduce him now. So we've mentioned that Tamara's Magdalene's friend, and she introduced him to someone, and we've also mentioned Wanda Hale, who was dating her eventual killer. So give us a little bit of an introduction into William Moore.
William Moore's an interesting character, I'll tell you. He died in prison 2 years ago, but he was a pretty fascinating character. He was a 50 year old African American man who worked at Cubs Foods for like 18 years. On his face, seemed like a working guy who, kind of middle age. But as dug a little deeper into him, it got very interesting. He had a kind of a violent background, especially when he was younger, armed robberies, gun arrests. And as it turned out, he was, well, I'll just quickly tell this story if you don't mind. In trying to track down those phone records, there was a house on the west side of Chicago, a home that had received multiple calls from that burnout phone. And we knew that house was what we call a problem house, a lot of drug arrests out there, a lot of activity. So we kind of put it off. But once Wanda told us that, she kind of made the connection. We worked with this guy. We went to the first Cubs Food where she worked. The manager there said, "Oh, I know who you're talking about. His nickname is Benny. That's how I remember him," which was William Moore. We decided to stop by this house on the west side of Chicago, which we had put off just to see, all right, maybe they else know somebody that works at Cubs Foods. Maybe they'll make a connection. So we stopped there, and the woman there is got a lifetime of dealing with the police. He wasn't buying our nonsense at all. We're like, we're looking into this, identity theft of this purse, and we're trying to ID. Do you know anybody that had a phone, worked at Cubs Food? She's like, nope, don't know nothing. Nope, sorry, can't help you. Nope, nope. And we're like, okay, thank you very much. She closes the door on us. We're like, all right, well, let's head to the other job. On the way to Cubs Foods, I get a call from a policeman I had worked with as a younger policeman, good friend of mine. And he said, "Hey, Mike, were you just at this house on the streets called West End, on West End, asking about a murder?" And I said, I was just there, but I'm saying about a murder. Why?" "Well, I have an informant over there, and they said you come by asking about a murder." And I kind of thought they weren't telling me the truth, but if you need anything, let me know. And, it's kind of protocol, just, that you don't ask about somebody's informant. I wouldn't say, "Hey, what's your informant's name?" if it's not pertinent or whatever, because, everybody wants to protect their informants. But I did tell him, "Hey, thanks a lot. I'll call you if it looks like I may need some help." So we go to the grocery store in Joliet. The manager there was a good dude and like one of these true crime aficionados, and he was super excited to help us. And he's like, "Yeah, I know who you're talking about. He's not working today." And, he tells us his name's William Moore or whatever. I said, "Do you have any contact?" And he goes, "Yeah, I got his emergency contact card here." And the emergency call and name is not only the house we had just left, but the woman who told us, "I don't know nothing," right? That was his emergency contact. And I'm like, holy. So I call my buddy back to Copper and I say, hey, man, I don't normally do this, but can I ask you, is your informant's name William Moore? And he said, how do you know that? And I said, I need to talk to your informant, brother. And I laid out the case, and then he tells me, well, he's helped me out, but he's really been my dad's informant for like 18 years. And his father, who I knew was a boss on the police department, really good boss, very well respected. But I thought at the time, man, this might complicate things. They've got a long term relationship, this guy and his commander. But it didn't, the commander never was always very cooperative. And he's like, yeah, I've worked with him. I got him that job 18 years ago, Cups Food. He's been very helpful with cases over the years, but I don't think he's a killer, but if he killed this woman, yeah, I don't want any, I'm not going to run interference. So that kind of started that chain of events where, we first interviewed William Moore actually with that commander there, which was an odd thing. And my commander wasn't crazy about it, but it turned out to be good because I think Moore was getting ahead a little bit. I'll stop, but I think it turned out Moore was afraid to tell an obvious lie in front of the commander, and that hurt him. That helped our case a lot.
We are going to go on to the interview you had with William Moore, but I do want to ask this first before I go on. Were you a little bit, maybe not surprised, but it maybe didn't sit right that an informant was potentially a murder suspect?
It's super unusual. Never happened to me before. And that's not it. I mean, I had my own informants that had committed murder over the years, but that is a little different in that they were players. I knew they were players. They're out playing the game, and they're involved in things. So that in itself, the whole dealing with informants is a tricky game. You got to be very careful with. But yeah, it did in the nature of it. It was. I just thought, this is so odd and so outside of my kind of comfort zone here, and my partners, you just didn't know where it was going to go at first. You know what I mean? As I said, as it turned out, the commander was great and wanted, to know the truth as much as us. But yeah, initially definitely is like, this is a wrinkle. After hundreds and hundreds of murders, you start to think. Of course, I was still a pretty young detective at that time, but work on the West Side of Chicago, you get a lot of cases. And that was even some of the old timers, and one of my partners was kind of an old timer. They're like, "Yep, this is a new one on me, man." you know.
Now, in this interview, William, you mentioned that with the commander there, it maybe made William fear telling obvious lies as often probably as he would have, but he did in the beginning have an obvious lie. Can you explain what he had claims of to do with these phone records?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so we conducted the interview in the commander's office, which is unusual, but he had that kind of relationship with him. He said, "Just tell me when you want to talk to him. I'll tell him to come into the office." And I thought, well, I mean, I think I even said to the commander, Commander, you really want him coming to your office? I stops by all the time, no worries. And so we did. And it felt a little uncomfortable, but it did work out well. But yeah, he basically started lying from the first. He said, in fact, one of them was so ridiculous. He said to us, so it was me and two of my partners and the commander, which is way too many people to be conducting an interview like that. But it's just the kind of the way it worked out. You know what I mean? And it was a atypical interview in a lot of ways. That was before we were mandated by law to record interviews of murder suspects, which did play a part later. So it was just kind of a almost casual conversation. Although I read him his rights and I told him, hey, we're looking at this murder and you have your right to remain silent and all that. You have a right to an attorney, all of those constitutional rights. And he just glossed over. Yeah, well, I understand. You tell the boss. You can ask the boss. I know all that. I said, okay, well, this is what we want to do. So and I kind of led the interview because my partners were older and more experienced, both of them like Vietnam vets, good detectives. But I just knew the case really well, and they just asked that I kind of lead, and um, I said, do you remember like 2001, because this is probably, I don't remember the exact date. It's probably on my notes, but I think it was probably
4,
2004. Okay,
May
yes.
17th.
Yeah, May 17th, 2004. Thank you. So 3 years later, and he's a little bit like, I don't really remember too much. I said, okay, do you remember having a cell phone at that time? You're working at Cubs Foods. And he says to me, I never owned a cell phone in my life. And he literally had a cell phone on a clip on his waist. And I'm like, Mr. Moore, and everyone ever call him that. He's, hey, call me Bill, call me Bill. I'm like, Bill, you got a cell phone on now. And he's like, oh, yeah, I just got this one. And the boss kind of interjected and said, Bill, like, what are you talking about? I've known you. You've had a cell phone for years. You're always calling me on a cell phone. And he's like, and he came off that and he goes, I don't think I had that cell phone, which was telling because I'm like, what cell phone? I haven't told you anything about the cell phone yet. And so then that kind of progressed, but I really had to work through the phone records. I said, do you know this person? Like including Wanda Hale, this person, which was his father's home, this person, the people there. And he would say, he was on, yeah, I know them. I know them. I know them. I know, yeah, I worked at that Cubs food. And so then I show him the phone records. I'm like, hey, look, Bill, like this is Wanda Hale. This is the Cubs food. This is like, who else in the world could have possessed that phone but you? And this is over the course of, an hour or so, and he kind of resigned and he's like, yeah, I just didn't remember the number, but yeah, that had to have been my phone. And then I said, okay, so you had it then on, Thanksgiving 2001, clearly, because and and he tells me this really fantastical well, first, he looks at the commander and says, "Hey, can we take a break?" And me and my partners are like, "Bad time to take a break." Like, you know what I mean? No, no. The commander didn't quite catch it, and he's like, "Yeah, come on, Bill." And it was fine. So that actually gave me a chance to regroup with, my a little more experienced partners and ask them, like, what do you think? And they're like, yeah, you're doing great, man. Like, so, just keep like he's responding. So don't get aggressive. Just keep talking to him. And so we reconvene after about 15 minutes and commander's like, okay, so he told me he was not telling the truth and he's just kind of nervous, but he wants to tell you. I said, all right, great. I said, so Bill, what's the story? He goes, yeah, I did have that phone. But he sold it. He goes, I sold it right before Thanksgiving to this hype. And that's street language here for like drug addict, hype, like heroin, hypodermic needle. It's just a kind of a slang term back in the day. Uh, and I said, what was that guy's name? And he gave me the guy's name, and it was a real generic name like Johnson. Uh, I don't remember, something Johnson. And it just sounded so implausible. And I looked at the commander, and even the commander was like, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Bill. I said, sorry, how do I find Mr. Johnson? You're not gonna be able to find him. He got killed doing a stick up like 2 months later. And I'm like, is that convenient? I said, all right. I said, but then I looked at phone records. I said, well, here's the problem, man. So you're telling me you sold this phone to the Johnson guy and he gets killed doing a stick up, a few weeks later, but the phone calls continue to your work, all the places you're calling. And he also denied initially that he'd ever met Magdalena. And then same process. We're like, nah, Tamara Cohen said she introduced you guys, and then I showed him the phone records. They were talking, and he eventually come around to that. And then his final kind of lie statement was that, okay, yes, I had the phone. I was talking to her. I never had any relationship with her. I never had sex with her. She did call me that night, but I was with this guy on the west side. We'd been at a dice game because he's a big gambler. And this guy, she calls me and she's trying to get me to hook her up with some players or whatever. This is his story. And I happened to be with this guy, DC, and I gave him the phone and he talked to her and they may have talked about hooking up. I don't know, but that was the last time that I talked to her. I don't know what happened. So then we were stuck with we needed his DNA, and it was gonna be easiest if he consented to it. Although we were on the verge of probably having enough to get a search warrant at that point, but I just asked him flat out. I said, "All right, this is easy to get out from under, Bill." I said, "Will you give us a sample of your DNA?" And his whole demeanor changed. He started sweating. To this day, I think the only reason he agreed to do that was he didn't wanna say no in front of the commander he had this long relationship with, because, man, I when he looked at the commander, I give my partners a side eye, and my partners are both like, "This is our guy." I mean, there's just the way his body changed. But he finally said, "Yeah, I'll do it," so at that point, I just stopped interviewing him. I knew he was caught in a bunch of lies. I really wanted to go more into that and see if I could gently get him to tell me more and more of the truth. But once he consented to that DNA, we had to have it. And so we just it stopped, and we called for an evidence technician to come and take the DNA sample. And in that interim, my partners and I talked, and we all just agreed, like, let's end it right now. It's either his DNA, it's not. If it is, he's the killer, and then we'll have to work towards cleaning that up. If it's not, we got to keep working. So that's what we did, and we asked the crime lab to expedite that DNA, and they did. And within a few days, they came back, said it's a match.
Now, anybody listening is going to think Williams taken straight now, he's on trial, and this is now where we get to the part where what happens to him next. But he doesn't officially get arrested until 2008. What happened in between there that stopped him from getting arrested sooner?
Well, yeah, so that's a good question and a frustrating thing. We had a lot to do. We still had people identified in reports as friends of hers. And even though it sounds a little kind of funky, but even though it was his DNA, uh, there were open profile DNA like on cigarettes in her ashtray. We had to find everybody still that we had listed in reports to be interviewed and get their DNA samples to compare, because you don't want to go to court unless it's absolutely no other option. You wanna close all those doors, right? You wanna be able to identify any open profile that you can, and that took several years to track people down, and it's just not tracking them down. We had his expedited, but they can't just expedite every one, and sometimes it takes 6 or 8 months to get a profile back from the lab. So, like, we had her mother, her brother, her brother's boyfriend, other friends that were female, just to eliminate like the cigarettes and the cigarette butt. Guys that we figured she had never had sex with, her friends, but we listed in reports, find them, get them to submit DNA samples. Of course, they came back negative. We had to tie up those phone records better. And we had to find DC, who he kind of made his alibi. And that was a tricky thing because I had a long term relationship with this guy, DC. He was kind of a big gang player on the West Side. Our relationship was not cordial. We'd had some run-ins over the years, and I knew approaching that he wasn't going to be. I figured he was not going to want to be cooperative, just by my interactions with him in the past. Tough guy, real gangster. It didn't work out that way at all, though. I found him at his mother's house. And he was at first like, "Hey, Hammond, what the hell are you doing at my mother's house?" But I said, "Look, DC," I said, "Hey, do you know this guy, Benny?" He called him Goldie. He had a couple different nicknames. And he goes, "Yeah, I know him." I said, so he tells me that on November 21st, I think it was 2001, you're in a car with him. He gives you a phone. You start talking to this girl, and you may have hooked up with her. And he's like, "I never been in a car with Goldie in my life. That's bullshit." And I said, "Well, all right." I said, "Look, so you're clear this girl shot to death that night." And he goes, "Shot to death? What are you talking about?" And I said, "Hey, who's the girl?" And I tell him, and he goes, "Wait, is he a white girl?" I said, "Yeah." He goes, "I never been with a white." What are you talking about? I said, "Well, this is his story, not mine, man." He goes, "Well, that is all BS, total." I said, "All right, well, if it is, and I believe you because it wasn't DC Coleman's DNA in her, you know what I mean? There was no connection to the phone other than Moore saying he handed it to him. There was no other connection to DC in this case. So there's no reason not to believe him, but I needed for him to say that. And to my surprise, he's like, "What do you need for me to do?" I said, "Come with me and talk to the state's attorney." He said, "Let's go." Got in a car, drove him to 26 in California, which is our big courthouse. State's attorney talked to him, put him right in the grand jury. He testified in front of the grand jury. That guy came to trial and testified, which I mean, he just wanted nothing to do with the murder that he didn't have any part of. But it's very unusual for a gangster like that to be that cooperative. But I think he was pissed. I also think by that time they had some inclination that Moore might have been an informant, which did come on a trial. We would have never brought out. His own attorney accidentally brought it up. But so that piece with DC also took some time, but that turned out to be a strong piece of evidence for us. Yeah, so it literally took, 4 years to finish all that, put the case together and get it. Because the whole time we're talking to the state's attorney's office, prosecutors about, all right, this case we got, and they're like, well, no, it's not quite enough. You need to close this door. You need to close, which we knew, but we also had him out there. And we were always living under there was no reason to believe he had killed any women before. You're always worried that he may, and that he's a suspect. It's just one of those weird things, and all detectives who work on these type of cases are under that kind of pressure that this guy's dangerous because by now you know in your heart that he's the killer, but you don't have enough yet to put the case together strong enough. And so you kind of got to let it run. We also had one more telling thing. I found a domestic violence arrest and we went out and talked to that woman. She told a pretty amazing tale in that she had met him working with him at Cubs Foods, William Moore. She dated him for a while and she kind of liked him, but he wasn't really responding. So she thought he really wasn't interested. One night she goes out, she's living with her mother. She goes out with another guy. It's not really anything, but he brings her home, gives her a peck on the cheek. She's walking in the house. William Moore uh, kind of appears out of nowhere and says, "Hey, can we talk?" And so she says, "Yeah." And so they go into her apartment, her mother's apartment. They go into her bedroom and he flips out on her. She said he switched like that, started threatening me, broke her arm, I think. She had him arrested, but she didn't go to trial, so it was dumped. But she told us the whole story, and she said interesting side note, he said her mother pulled a gun on him and made him leave, or he would have hurt her worse, she thought, which kind of wasn't apropos of anything with our homicide, but it does go to his mentality, right? Like that flip of a switch, which I believe is what happened with Magdalena, probably. But then we get everything together and the state's attorney says, all right, well now it's required by law 4 years later that you videotape all suspects of murder, which I was good with, but they said you need to get him in at the very least, re-interview him, have him tell those same lies on video, and ideally get him admit to the crime, So that was how that kind of shook out.
Yeah. So we're now quite a while on from your first meeting of William, and up until this point now, where we're at in the story, you only thing you've really had with William at that point is what you just mentioned, this story of another woman. So you haven't seen William since May 17th, two thousand
Yeah.
four. Tell us a little bit about what happens when you meet him again, February 5th, 2008.
Yeah. So we had a lot going on and I had kind of set up with the prosecutor's office. We're going to bring him in, interview him again on video. And of course, we wanted to go arrest him ourselves, but we weren't sure where he was at. And I, we just had a lot of moving parts at that point. So I called some buddies of mine who were in the gang investigation unit And they're brilliant at finding people who don't want to be found. And I don't know that Moore was actually hiding at that time. Probably not. I think he thought he was not at Cubs Foods anymore, but I think he probably thought, well, they haven't arrested me. My DNA must not match. I got lucky, whatever. And they found him for us in pretty short order and brought us in. So then we put him in an interview room. We turned the video on, and I sat and interviewed him again. And I basically um, I needed him to tell me that same story. So I just kind of walked him through it. I Mirandized him, I gave him his rights again. And he was the same. This time, he was buddy buddy. This is a guy who, is used to talking to the police, right? He's 18-year informant. I think he thought I can slick out of this because he called me Mike. He wanted me to call him Bill, and the whole conversation was very amicable. And I'm like, Bill, listen, so you've read your rights, whatever. Do you want an attorney? Do you want to, I'll talk to you, man. What do you want to know? And I said, so you told me this, this, this. He just walked back through and confirmed, oh, yeah, no, man. And even the lies that he admitted to, I said, the whole Johnson thing you made up. Why did you do that? He goes, I was nervous, man. That was a lie. I'm sorry, and about not ever knowing her the same. He's like, yeah, I lied to you. It was critical to have all that on video. I mean, it was 8 hours or better of interviewing him. And then once I had all that established, like he had lied about having the phone, lied about knowing her at DC, but he would never get to the point where he went to the scene. He just said, yeah, I talked to her, but I never met her. That he admitted that story with DC wasn't true. So then I hit him with the DNA. I said, look, man, it's your DNA. And he's like, can't be. And I showed him the thing, like there's a 1 in 8 trillion chance or whatever, those crazy numbers they put on those DNA reports. I said, by my account, uh, Bill, there's only something like 8 billion people in the world. And I don't know outside of the world. I don't know how many people lived in the history of the world, but trillions, it's you, brother. It ain't nobody else. And he's like, well, yeah, I see what you're saying, but I never had sex with her. Right? He just stayed with it. And then I tried to, he had to take a break to take medication, and which you have to be very careful with. It was like high blood pressure medication. We took him to the hospital to administer the medication because we can't give him medication station. We brought him back, talked to him. Yeah, I'm fine. I'm good. Just need me to take my medication, whatever. And then I try to go a little bit harder and say, hey, Bill, like, man, I believe you killed. I'm not saying here. And then he started saying things to me like, well, that would make me a monster. Like, that would make me a monster. And like, I felt like he wanted to admit it. He just wanted it kind of an out. I told him, no, man. Like, and then you have to play this kind of empathetic game, which can be a little ugly sometimes, but you just have to do it, when you're trying to get. I'll tell them, no, not necessarily, man. Everybody, women and men argue, things go bad, and everybody loses their temper. It doesn't make you a monster. And I tried that, and he just wouldn't quite get there. He would sit for a long time thinking about it. I think, and this goes on for a while. And man, I wanted him to tell me what happened just out of like wanting to know. By this time, I knew the family really well, and I knew he killed her. He knew I knew. I just wanted to hear him say it, but there was a knock on the door, and so I said, "Hey, Bill, can we take a break?" He goes, "Yeah, can I get you something to drink?" He said, "Yeah." So I got him. I don't remember what it was, but I got him something to drink, and I went out. My partners were like, "Hey, Mike, like it might be time to end this," And the state's attorney, the worry that we had was that he might say at some point, okay, look, I lied to you. I'm so sorry. I lied. I had sex with her, but I didn't kill her and I left. And as implausible as that might be, that could throw a monkey wrench in the case, right? Because nobody else is there. Nobody saw it. The video doesn't show it. Why give him that out? And so my partners and the state's attorney were like, maybe we just end it here. Like it's as good as it's going to get. He's the killer. We may never know exactly what happened there, but your probably playing with a little bit of fire here. And I was a little hesitant with that, as you can imagine. I'm like, nah, he's gonna tell me that the guy likes me. He's looking for an out. But they were right. They were right. And so that we ended it there, and they charged him, and we went to trial.
Yeah. So now we fast forward to January 25th, 2010, which is the trial of William Moore. But the trial itself is a little bit unusual. Some of the details are a little bit weird. They're probably out of the ordinary for you to being in these courtrooms. Tell us a little bit about the trial of William Moore.
Yeah, there were several, odd things, like the whole informant thing. His attorney was a public defender at the time, and she was a very competent attorney. And like one of the things was we were never going to. It wasn't pertinent to the case that he had been an informant for all those years. And by just the nature of, we're not going to bring that out. Not pertinent to the case. We're not trying to get somebody killed. We're not trying to hurt other cases that he may have worked on. But his attorney, in not communicating, I don't think he ever told her, because she seemed irritated when it did come out, because she started hammering my partner on why we interviewed him in the commander's office, because it really is unusual, right? Why would you do it there? It doesn't make sense. He tried to slow walk it, but the judge finally was catching the drift and said, answer the question, detective. So my partner said, well, he was a long-term informant for that commander, and he was able to get him in. And she stopped immediately, went and talked to him, and then they stopped that line of questioning. So they kind of blew themselves up there, but not that it matters one way or another. The other thing too is he did not take the stand in that trial. And and that was surprising because, again, I don't know if she wanted him to and he didn't want to, or usually it's a bad idea for a defendant to take a stand. Except in this case, if he goes on there and gives applause, he says something like, yes, I lied, I met her there, and I had sex with her, but I didn't kill her. Maybe it causes reasonable doubt in the jury's mind. I think there was such a preponderance of other things, it might have been difficult. He didn't do that. And the other thing that turned out to be strange in that case was, I don't know, do you want to go to the appeal now, or you want to kind of wrap that first part up of the first trial?
Yeah, we can probably start moving into it now because we know there's another, again, unusual part because at the end of that first trial, he is sentenced to 30 years. But we now go to the summer of 2016, and William Moore is in court again. Tell us about that.
Correct. He was actually sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years because he was convicted of her murder and her criminal sexual assault. Right. Uh, so the judge sentenced him to life in prison for the murder and 30 years for the sexual assault. Yeah, and then several years later, we get notified. I get notified from prosecutor's office that the appellate court had overturned his case, and we were going to have to retry it. And the reason that they overturned it was they ruled that he had ineffective counsel, meaning his attorney didn't do something she should have done. And that was, they claimed that the jury should not have seen the entirety of his interview with me, because in that interview, he admits to prior crimes like the armed robbery and gang affiliation. And for that to be properly entered into court, the prosecutor has to lay the groundwork to why that's pertinent to the case. It wasn't done in this. The reason it wasn't done is because the prosecutor redacted that video, so the jury never saw the entirety of the video. The jury they saw had that redacted out, so they didn't hear about his prior crimes or his gang, and that's why she didn't object to the video. And his own attorney, the judge, and of course the prosecutor testified in front of the appellate court. The judge didn't testify. wrote letters saying that they didn't see that. But for some reason, the appellate court said, well, she should have objected anyway on the record. And so they sent it back for retrial. So we had to retry the entire case again, or family had to go through that again. And we did.
And what was the verdict?
Same. This time he did take the stand and he did say a version of he went there and met her, had sex, but he left. But the prosecutor did a brilliant job of exposing all of his lies and catching him in lies on the stand. He really hurt himself. This time he was represented by a very respected law firm who did it pro bono for free. And the second judge, different judge, heard it. The jury found him guilty again. The second judge sentenced him the same exact sentence, life plus 30 years. I don't know what 30 years does on top of life, but at here, whatever that is, he still had owed him 30 years. And William Moore had developed some health problems. He was close to 60 by that time, and he died in prison 2 years ago.
So this is where we are now. The case is closed. It's finished. Like you've said now, unfortunately, family had to go through 2 trials, but there was never accurately painted of what actually happened that night. What genuinely did happen to Magdalen. Did you ever find out anything else along the way that painted that picture, or is it still just not accurate?
No, in fact, when I kind of kicked myself when I found out that he had died, I I wish that I would have gone to the prison and talked to him one more time and see if he would have just, you know, at that time, he'd have been on a deathbed. Maybe he had nothing to. Um, I think we don't know for sure. My partners and I have kind of a strong hypothesis that we believe we know what happened. But to an absolute, yeah, we'll never know exactly what happened there. The only thing we will know is William Moore killed Magdalena Idzikowska. And
You mentioned that you kind of kick yourself that you didn't go and see him before he died to see if maybe on his deathbed he would admit it. But do you think he would have admitted it to you? Because in the second trial, he claims you threatened him in the interview.
yeah, he did, but that didn't wash very well because all that was on video. And he did. He said I threatened him and I did all these things, which is very typical. I mean, we're used to that. Defendants say that almost every time. But we had it all is on video. It wasn't not only not threat. He was like, "Hey, Mike, call me Bill." He was super, friendly. They didn't get very well with that far with that argument. There was never threats. There was never any need for me to threaten him. I mean, I guess the most that you could say, uh, um, that might be construed as a threat, and I didn't even say it in a, like, overbearing way. I just said, "Hey, Bill, if you're convicted of this, you likely are going to spend the rest of your life in prison. If you have some story to tell, now's the time to tell it, because you won't get another chance." But that was exactly in this tone I just told you, and his response was just the same as I told you. Well, that would make me a monster, Mike. That would make me a monster. I'm not even sure what he meant by that. I maybe he felt like a monster and he didn't. I don't know. I'll never know it. But do I feel like he would have talked to me? He would have talked to me. He'd have been glad to see me. I mean, that's just the way he was. Would he have admitted to what happened? You just never know. I went to prisons hundreds of times to interview people, and literally, if I did it 150 times, I only remember one time where a guy said, "I ain't talking to you." I mean, the guys in prison are always glad to talk. Now, rarely do they want to talk about what you want to talk about. They're just glad to have somebody to talk to, but you still often get some really interesting information. Yeah, he'd have definitely talked to me. Would he admitted to it? Maybe because he was near the end and he wanted to clear his conscience. Maybe. We'll never know. And I didn't know that he was that sick, so I don't really beat myself up over it. It is what it is. But it's just, it's one of those doors you'd like to have closed. But after working hundreds and hundreds of murders, you start to understand that you're not always going to get all the answers you want. You do the best you can. You build the best cases that you can. And that's sometimes you really get all the answers. Sometimes it's all on video. And a lot of times, you got to go where the evidence takes you. And that's the best you can do.
So one last question before I let you go, but with the craziness of this case, I mean, it's just so many turns in it. There's so many things. There's still stones that are left unturned, but killer was put away. He's now no longer here. He can no longer hurt anyone else. And from what we know, every turn was checked. Do you feel like justice was served?
I do, because, her family are tremendous human beings, and not just them. I'm consistently amazed by victims' families and their ability to, not every single one, obviously, and that's fair. But I've been consistently amazed at the way victims' families of these horrible crimes can sometimes find forgiveness in their heart and move on with their lives. And certainly Magdy's family has. They're very, deeply religious people. They never wanted vengeance. Even if there was a death penalty, they wouldn't have wanted it. They just didn't want him to hurt anybody else. Once they heard the entirety of the case, they were like, there's no doubt he killed Maggie. And they just didn't want him to ever be able to hurt anybody again. And in that regard, that came to fruition. And there is zero chance that, William Moore was innocent of this crime. It's just the totality of it was overwhelming. Yeah, that's as best justice as you're ever gonna get, probably. I think, again, that part of me that hungers for answers would have loved to have known exactly what happened, but I got a feeling it would have played out exactly as we believe it did?
Mike, thank you very much for coming. It's been an absolute pleasure, and this has been a whirlwind of things. But before you go,
Yeah.
let the people know where can they find you, what have you got going on at the moment, and what have you got coming in the future.
Oh, sure, thank you, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on, a really, fun conversation, even though it's a heavy subject matter. Yeah, so I have a podcast, it's called Detective Story with Mike Hammond. You can reach me directly if you want to reach out. And my email is just mike at detectivestory.net. Detective story singular. That's also my website, www.detectivestory.net. And we're on YouTube and all the things like you. But I enjoy the interaction. If any of your listeners has questions, they're welcome to reach out to me. There's no silly questions. Happy to answer anything. I really enjoy the interaction. I'm writing a fictional book that hopefully will be out later in the year. And so that's what I got.